This is the reading commentary on the Tim Tackett reading, When the King Took Flight. We're going to be reading this book for a while. I'm having you read the whole book. And part of the reason I'm having you do that is because of the way that Tackett thinks about history and the way he organizes history. I've given the name, and this is not a name Tackett would recognize, but I've given the name contingency theory to Tackett's approach to history. And incidentally, this is also the approach down the road that we'll see from David Andrus. But contingency theory basically is this idea that history happens because people make decisions. And so, and Tackett actually, and I mean, the whole book here is focused on one event. The king tries to get out of Paris and run to the border. He gets stopped and brought back. And Tackett really presents this as a turning point in the revolution, that things could have gone differently, but they didn't. And Tackett really likes to point out that a number of times and places where people made decisions that had momentous effects, because had the king made some different decisions about his plans for leaving, he might have made it escaped. Had the people in the village of Varennes made different decisions, they could have let the king go. There are all sorts of different decisions. Had the military commanders who were supposed to escort the king not made the decision to leave when they thought he wasn't coming, that could have had an effect on the outcome. There are all sorts of points, Tackett points out, at which people made decisions, and those decisions had huge impacts on the way things went, right? And this is why I call it contingency theory. And again, that's just my term, it's not Tackett's term. That at all these different points, people make decisions, and the outcome is contingent upon what those decisions those people made. And so contingency theory, Tackett's approach to history, you sort of saw already with Lefebvre that he likes to talk about this class did this, the bourgeoisie did this, and et cetera. And he mentions a lot of names, but it sort of seems like the actors are social classes. And we saw with Furet that he really didn't talk very much about individual people standing up and saying things or anything like that. He's talking about these discourses, these chunks of language, and this vacuum, and how people understood sovereignty, etc. Tackett is the opposite. He goes heavy into narrative. He really looks at the very fine details. For him, the devil is always in the details. If you really want to understand history, you have to understand the really minute details, because those often are the most revealing, he would say. And he argues that you have to look at really the even small decisions can often have major effects, and people's personalities have a huge effect. Tackett would argue that Louis XVI's personality had a huge impact on the course of the French Revolution, because a person with a different personality in his position would have acted differently, and the revolution might have gone in a very different direction. And so Tackett's theory, he tends to focus a lot on detail, and this is part of why I had you read the whole book, because I want to give you a sense of Tackett, but Tackett's approach is very detail and narrative oriented, so you have to get the whole narrative with all the details. But Tackett also focuses a lot on personality, right? On different people making different decisions, and Tackett isn't sure that we can ever really know why they made those decisions. We just know that they did, and that changed the course of things, right? And so Tackett's version of history is a story, and it's a story that has a bunch of actors making decisions which change the course of the narrative and cause it to take the course it does. And so for Tackett, there was nothing said about the French Revolution when it started. There was nothing that said it had to go this direction or that direction. And in fact, Tackett has another book called Becoming a Revolutionary, where he looks at all the letters he could find for the National Assembly, right? The three estates go to Versailles, and then they name themselves the National Assembly after Bastille Day, and then for the next 2 years they write the Constitution. And Tackett actually, he actually sort of wanted to take on Furet, because Furet said the government collapsed, and then nobody knew how to talk about government, and all the people who were suddenly in power had no experience of actually governing, and so they took up these ideas from Rousseau of the general will and the people, etc., and they sort of created this abstract vision of power, which really led to all sorts of problems. And in particular, it was the use of Rousseau, Furet says, that really led to these problems. Well, Tackett actually, to try to find out if Furet is right, he goes and he reads all these letters from 2 years of the National Assembly, because lots of members of the National Assembly wrote regular letters home to the people back in their districts saying, here's what's going on, and they wrote letters to their husbands and wives, and I mean their wives, none of them were female, so they wouldn't have husbands. But Tackett finds that there's very little language that sounds like Rousseau. Very few people are mentioning Rousseau by name. Very few people are using Rousseau's terminology. And so Tackett argues, in fact, that what happens is that over the first 2 years of the National Assembly, Rousseau, that some members of the National Assembly actually sort of inadvertently teach the other members of the National Assembly about Rousseau. And so he's questioning Furet's timeline by looking at the details, by looking at what each person is saying and doing. And that's really the sort of heart of Tackett's approach. Is he really says to do history well, you have to get into the details, you have to look at what each person is saying, what how that fits with what they're doing. You have to look at all these little actions, and it all adds up to the outcome, the history. Well, that's sort of what I call contingency theory. And this is Tackett's approach, and later it's Andrus's approach also. What are the pros and cons, right? I mean, I talked a little bit about the pros and cons of Marxist theory, in particular that, Marxist theory, on the one hand, it tends to oversimplify, right? People are just shoved into slots, you're bourgeois, you're aristocratic, whatever, and it might not match the details in every particular. But on the plus side, the Marxist interpretation allows you to really sort of see the larger forces at work, right? You get to see the big picture, if you will. And Furet's approach, and we'll see with Baker's approach also, is that often ideas shape things, and so you can see the sort of clash of ideas happening in the conversations between people. And so again, someone like Furet or Baker sometimes sacrifices the minute details in order to get a larger picture. And the advantage of these two approaches is that by looking at the bigger picture, they can focus on what are the main forces driving this. Because with history, it's often very easy to get distracted by all sorts of little tiny details. But you ultimately want to understand, why did this happen? And often it's big forces pushing through society that shape individual actions. Well, Tackett takes the opposite approach. And so what are some of the pros and cons of his approaches? Well, on the pro side, I think you'll see when you read it, is that Tackett's approach to history really tends to match the lived experience of the people who were there. Meaning that he really tries to put you in the shoes of the people who were there, so you really understand what they were thinking about, right? Now, Tackett will say you can't really know what they were thinking because they didn't tell you what they were thinking at the time, but through the detail, through the evidence that we have left from history, we can make pretty good guesses as to what they were thinking and what the experience was for them. What was the dilemma as they understood it? How did they think about their choices? And why did they choose what they chose, right? So it matches what's called lived experience, which is the experience of the people who actually lived through it, and how did they think about it while they were living through it. It also gives a lot of complexity. You really understand when you read Tackett how all these different people were making different decisions, and each decision had impacts on how other people made decisions. And it's really this complex system where everybody's pulling in different directions and acting on their own, and the outcome is the history. And so you really understand the complexity of history there. So those are two of the advantages of Tackett's approach. On the other hand, Tackett's approach really kind of obscures the larger patterns of history. Or to put it slightly differently, Tackett points out that the flight to Varennes was a key turning point. It changed everything. That the revolution before this is different from the revolution after this. But to a certain extent, his approach of focusing on individual decisions doesn't explain why it was a key turning point, right? What shifted that was so different afterwards than before? Someone like Furet would say, well, one set of ideas got discredited and people started groping for another set of ideas. But for Tackett, he gets so connected to the details that it often you wonder, why, what do we know about the larger patterns, right? We get so caught up in the details that we can lose sight of the larger pattern, the larger moments of the revolution, that this period was sort of characterized by this, and this period was sort of characterized by this. But if you go down too far into the details, you start to lose track of that, and you don't have, it gets harder to see the sort of periods and details, and the periods because of the details, and you wind up having just a whole bunch of details without having any larger patterns that you can see of the revolution happening. A second issue is that Tackett clearly focuses on how people made decisions and what decisions they made and what the impacts of those decisions were. But he's less strong, and this is partly intentional on his part, he doesn't focus on how people made their decisions as much. I mean, he doesn't really give us an insight into what caused this person to look at the options and say this was the better option. He tends to say, well, this was the option they chose. And occasionally, if somebody clearly lays out their thought process, Tackett is happy to go with it, but he's very uncomfortable speculating about why people made these decisions. And something like Marxist or post-structuralist theory offers a larger explanation for why people made decisions. In other words, post-structuralists to say, this group of people was really shaped by this set of ideas, and so when it came time to make a decision, they're going to view it this way, which leads to this conclusion. It's a logical process. If you start from these assumptions and this set of ideas about how the world works, it's a logical process to make that decision, right? But Tackett's fairly uncomfortable saying this person was shaped by the language and was pushed in the direction of that decision by the logic of the language. Tackett says, no, they really had a choice. But that doesn't help us to say, well, why did they make that choice? And in particular, Tackett focuses on these moments like the Flight to Rennes, where a small number of people made decisions that had big impacts. He tends to focus a little less on the moments where you had a large number of people, like the storming of the Bastille, making decisions. But if you have a large number of people all making the same decision, it sort of raises the question, why did they all come to that same conclusion? And that's where the post-structuralists or the Marxists would say, well, there were larger forces at work here shaping the way people thought, and so they all came to the same decision because they were all in the proletariat, and they all thought the same, or they all came to the same decision because they had all, had embraced this set of ideas which led to this logical conclusion. And so they were all led logically to the same conclusion because they all started from the same assumptions in the same place, right? So post-structuralists and Marxists are better at explaining the decisions of large groups of people or the movements of large groups of people, perhaps. And Tackett might be better at explaining the decisions of individuals. Ultimately, of course, you don't have to have just one theory. But this is really an interesting question. I mean, this might be the question in history, is why do people make the decisions they do? Because often when we look back at history, we look back at the Middle Ages or something, we're like, why would people think that? That's crazy, that's stupid, right? Why would that seem reasonable then? But we have to remember, it really did seem reasonable to them at the time. It really did seem like the best decision, right? I mean, when the plague is ripping through Europe and a lot of people decided to go kill the Jews, it seemed like a good idea to them. To us, it's like, well, that's crazy, that's stupid. It was a disease, it was bacteria. Why would you kill the Jews over that? In order to understand that decision, you have to go back to the Middle Ages and understand how they thought about how the world worked, what they thought disease was, how they thought it fit into God's larger plan, what they thought of, how they thought about Jews as outside of the community, etc. You have to understand that whole worldview in order to understand why they made that decision, right? But that's really the key to all of history, is that on the one hand, we all know that as individuals, We go through life and we make decisions as individuals, and we're just deciding what we think is best, and we don't feel like we're being shaped by larger forces. I mean, if you think about your life right now, yes, you could say, okay, the pandemic is a big force shaping my life right now. We're doing online classes because of that. But you feel like you're making day-to-day decisions rationally. But historians in the future are going to say, well, lots of people made decisions, different decisions, right? We've got people protesting stay-at-home orders in lots of states right now. They're making decisions based on a set of assumptions they have, a set of values they have, that lead them to a certain logic of this has to stop. Whereas the people who are staying at home have a different set of assumptions and values and a different thought process. And this is the trick of history, is that ultimately each individual feels they're free to make whatever decision they want to. But if you look at the larger scope of history, it's pretty clear that people in this time period tend to think this way, and people in that time period tend to think that way. And so clearly the individual is shaped by the larger culture, the larger social structures, the larger social classes. And so how do you balance this, right? How do you balance this sense that individuals are free to make their own decisions, but in the larger sense, most individuals make the same decisions as the other individuals in that culture, in that time, in that place? Or how do you come up with any larger pattern? Right? And that's really the crux of the matter with theory in general in history, is that theory provides you with a big picture explanation. Right? Here's the big picture. But theory often oversimplifies to make that big picture clear. And when you get down into the details of history, you realize how much theory simplifies things. But if you dump the theory and just go with all the detail, you wind up with a massive detail. And how do you decide what's important detail and what's unimportant detail, and what's the story here if it's just a massive detail, right? And how do you decide what are the important things that you're going to put in the story, right? So Tackett and the Marxists are sort of at opposite ends. The Marxists say, here's this one big story that explains everything in history, and it's always class conflict, etc. And they're often pretty sloppy on the details, meaning the details don't quite fit their theory perfectly, although in the big picture, often it looks like things are fitting Marxist theory pretty well. On the other end, you have Tackett, who says, well, let's look at the detail, and Tackett provides a lot of good detail, and he makes sense of details, but Tackett might not give you a big picture that's quite as compelling or clear as the Marxists, and it might be hard to see the causes for the French Revolution. It might be hard to see why things went this way in the French Revolution with contingency theory. So I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm not saying any of the three, four if you include Britain that we've done so far is really better than the other. But it is an interesting thing to think about, is how do we make sense of history? How do we find the big patterns and see the larger story and the big forces shaping history? But then how do we reconcile that to the granular detail where the individuals seem to be free to make their own decisions, and those decisions often change the course of history? How do we reconcile these two different sort of levels of causation? The big, long, what the French call longue durée, the long-term shifts in history, with this sort of granular individual choice level of causation. How do you make sense of that? That's one of the things we're going to wrestle with the rest of the course. So here's a good start for understanding Tackett.